This was an article sent to me by one of the many subscribers that send me information. It's the first slave owner in America was a black man. Now, this is, again, part of the control of the media, why they, in schools and stuff, you'll never see things like this, and this is why it's important for Yahweh's children to get the truth out through other means, because they control the mainstream. First slave owner in America was black. According to colonial records, the first slave owner in the United States was a black man. Prior to 1655, there were no legal chattel slaves in the colonies, only indentured servants. And I remember when I was a boy studying history, etc., that is absolutely true. It was called indentured servitude. It was illegal to have a chattel slave as it was done in ancient times. You could be an indentured servant, but not a chattel slave. And we'll talk about what the difference between that is here in a minute. Sharp50 says, Dan, thanks for your show. I enjoyed it, especially while I was in Russia. Oh, excellent. We got our brethren coming together from all over the world. It's amazing. Rebecca says here that at topconservativenews.com is the article about the first slave owner being black. So there you have a URL for a website where you can go get more information on this. And I've read it from other places, too. At the beginning of the Civil War, more slaves were in the hands of other black people than there were white people. But you never hear any of this stuff because it's the propaganda. It wouldn't be propaganda if they told you the truth. So prior to 1655, only indentured servants, which is biblical. Why? Because the colonists were Israelites. So they did it biblically. The Bible allows for indentured servitude. All masters were required to free their slaves after their time was up. 7 years was the limit that an indentured servant could be held. Now, where do you think the 7 years comes from? Okay, come on now, think. 7 years is what? A jubilee. That's a biblical term. Why do you think in the United States your bankruptcy can only be done once every 7 years? Yeah, that's right, because it comes out of the Bible. If you declare bankruptcy, that's a biblical act, declaring bankruptcy. You cannot pay your bills. That's okay, because the Bible allows for the fact that some people are not able to do that, but you can't do it again for another 7 years. You get once every 7 years, you get a jubilee to free yourself from debt. That's where the 7-year period comes from. The master says here, Dan, where in Scripture is sola scriptura? Don't speak Latin. Okay. So anyway, a 7-year limit. Upon their release, they were granted 50 acres of land. You don't even get that today. You'd be taxed off of it if they gave it to you. And here these people were getting 50 acres at the end of their indentured servitude. This included any black African purchased from slave traders. Blacks were also granted 50 acres upon their release. Anthony Johnson was a black man from modern-day Angola. He was brought to the United States to work on a tobacco farm. Of course, we were not the United States yet, but the colonies, to work on a tobacco farm in 1619. In 1622, he was almost killed when the Powhatan Indians attacked the farm. 52 out of 57 people on the farm perished in the attack. He married a black female servant while working on the farm. When Anthony was released, he was legally recognized as a, quote, free Negro or free black man and ran a successful farm. In 1651, he held 250 acres, and he had 5 black indentured servants. In 1654, it was time for Anthony to release John Casor, a black indentured servant. Instead, Anthony told Casor he was extending his time of indentured servitude. Casor left and became employed by the free white man, Robert Parker. We'll continue that story in just a second. Anthony Johnson sued Robert Parker in Northampton Court in 1654. In 1655, the court ruled that Anthony Johnson, the black guy, could hold the other black man, John Kasor, indefinitely. Now, see, they were wrong for doing that, but that's what they ruled. The court gave judicial sanction for blacks to own members of their own race as chattel slaves. Thus, Kasor became the first permanent slave, and Johnson, the other black man, became the first slave owner. Whites still could not legally hold a slave or a black servant as a chattel slave until 1670. In that year, the Colonial Assembly passed legislation permitting free whites, blacks, and Indians the right to own blacks as slaves. So you see it has a little different start than what we've been told, huh? Just a little bit. By 1699, the number of free blacks prompted fears of a Negro insurrection. Virginia Colonial, I don't know how, I think somebody miswrote this here, but Virginia Colony ordered the repatriation of freed blacks back to Africa. Many blacks sold themselves to white masters so they would not have to go to Africa. This was the first effort to gently repatriate free blacks back to Africa. The modern nations of Sierra Leone and Liberia both originated as colonies of repatriated former black slaves. Also, interesting enough, the freed black slaves who went back to Africa turned right around and started plantations and enslaved other blacks to run them. They didn't learn much, did they? This article mentions Sierra Leone. Isn't it funny how a few years ago Sierra Leone had one tribe go after another tribe, and in the end 2 million black people were murdered, and not one story about that in the American press. Continuing, however, black slave owners continued to thrive in the United States. By 1830, there were 3,775 black families living in the South who owned black slaves. By 1860, there were about 3,000 slaves owned by black households in the city of New Orleans alone.